Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're reading again from Swiss Family Robinson, starting with Chapter 8, Construction of a Bridge. When my wife and I awaked the next morning, we resumed the question of our change of abode. I observed to her that it was a matter of difficulty and that we might have reason to repent such a step. My own opinion is, said I, that we had better remain here where Providence seems to have conducted us. The place is favorable to our personal safety and is near the vessel from which we may continue to enrich ourselves. We are on all sides protected by the rocks. It is an asylum inaccessible but by sea or by the passage of the river, which is not easily accomplished. Let us then have patience yet a little longer at least, till we have got all that can be removed or that would be useful to us from the ship. My wife replied that the intense heat of the sands was insupportable, that by remaining we lost all hope of procuring fruits of any kind and must live on oysters or on wild birds. As for the safety you boast of, pursued she, the rocks did not prevent our receiving a visit from the jackals, nor is it improbable that tigers or other animals might follow their example. Lastly, as to the treasures we might continue to draw from the vessel, I renounce them with all my heart. We are already in possession of provisions and other useful things, and to say the truth, my heart is always filled with distressing apprehensions when you and Fritz are exposed to the danger of that perfidious element, the sea. We will then think seriously of the matter, but let us have a well-digested scheme of operation before we leave this spot for your favorite wood. First, we must contrive a storehouse among the rocks for our provisions and other things, and to which, in the case of invasion in the wood, we can retreat and defend ourselves. This agreed, the next thing is to throw a bridge across the river if we are to pass it with all our family and baggage. A bridge? Exclaimed my wife. Can you possibly think of such a thing? If we stay while you build a bridge, we may consider ourselves as fixed for life. Why should we not cross the river as we did before? The ass and the cow will carry all we possess upon their backs. But do you recollect that to keep what they carry dry, they must not perform their journey as they did from the vessel? For this reason, then, if for no other, we must contrive a bridge. We shall want also some sacks and baskets to contain our different matters. You may therefore set about making these, and I will undertake the bridge, which the more I consider, the more I find to be of indispensable necessity. Thus, then, we decided the important question of removing to a new abode, after which we fixed upon a plan of labor for the day and then awaked the boys. Their delight on hearing of our project may easily be conceived, but they expressed their fear that it would be a long while before a bridge could be built. We now began to look about for breakfast. My wife undertook to milk the cow and afterwards gave some of the milk to each of the children. With a part of what remained, she made a sort of sop with biscuits, and the rest she put into one of the flasks to accompany us in our expedition. During this time, I was preparing the boat for another journey to the vessel to bring away a sufficient quantity of planks and timbers for the bridge. After breakfast, we set out, and now I took with me Ernest as well as Fritz, that we might accomplish our object in a shorter time. We rowed stoutly till we reached the current, which soon drew us on beyond the bay, but scarcely had we passed a little islet lying to one side of us than we perceived a prodigious quantity of seagulls and other birds. I had a curiosity to discover what could be the reason of such an assemblage of these creatures. I steered for the spot, but finding that the boat made but little way, I hoisted my sail. I approached near enough to step upon the land, and after bringing the boat to an anchor with a heavy stone, we stole softly up to the birds. We soon perceived that the object which attracted them was in reality an enormous fish, which had been thrown there by the sea. So eagerly were they occupied with the feast that not one of them attempted to fly off. We observed with astonishment the extreme voracity of this plumed group. Excuse me. Each bird was so intent upon its prey that we might have killed great numbers of them with our sticks alone. Fritz did not cease to express his wonder at the monstrous size of the animal, and asked me by what means it could have got there. I believe, answered I, you were yourself the means. There is every appearance that it is the very shark you wounded yesterday. See, here are the 2 balls which you discharged at its head. Yes, it is the very same, said my young hero, skipping about for joy. I well remember. I had 2 balls in my gun, and here they are, lodged in its head. Ernest drew out the iron ramrod from his gun, and by striking with it to right and left among the birds, soon dispersed them. Excuse me. Fritz and I then advanced and cut several long strips of the skin from the head of the shark, with which we were proceeding to our boat, when I observed lying on the ground some planks and timbers which had recently been cast by the sea on this little island. On measuring the longest, we perceived they would answer our purpose, and with the assistance of the crow and a lever which we had brought with us, found means to get them into the boat, and thus spare ourselves the trouble of proceeding to the vessel. With great exertion of our strength, we contrived to bind the timbers together with the planks upon them in the manner of a raft, and tied them to the end of the boat, so that through this adventure we were ready to return in 4 hours from the time of departure, and might boast of having done a good day's work. We were once more landed safely on our shore, but no one of our family appeared. We called to them as loud as we could, which was answered by the same sounds in return, and in a few minutes my wife appeared between her 2 little boys, returning from the river, a rising piece of ground having concealed her from our sight. Each carried a handkerchief in hand, which appeared filled with some new prize, and little Francis had a small fishing net formed like a bagon, strung upon a stick, which he carried on his shoulder. No sooner did they hear our voices than they flew to meet us, surprised at our quick return. Jack reached us before the rest, and his first act was to open the handkerchief he held and pour out a large number of lobsters at our feet. Their mother and little Francis produced each as many more, forming altogether a prodigious heap, and all alive, so that we were sure of excellent dinners for some days at least. After we had given an account of our voyage, my wife set about dressing some of the lobsters, and in the meantime Fritz and I employed ourselves in untying the raft of timbers and planks, and in moving them from the boat. I then imitated the example of the Laplanders in harnessing their reindeer for drawing their sledges. Instead of traces, halters, etc., I put a piece of rope with a running knot at the end round the neck of the ass, and passed the other end between its legs, to which I tied the piece of wood which I wished to be removed. The cow was harnessed in the same manner, and we were thus enabled to carry our materials, piece by piece, to the spot which had been chosen at the river as the most eligible for our bridge. It was a place where the shore on each side was steep and of equal height. There was even on our side an old trunk of a tree lying on the ground, which I foresaw would have its use. "Now then, boys," said I, "the first thing is to see if our timbers are long enough to reach the other side. By my eye I should think they are, but if I had a surveyor's plane we might be quite sure instead of working at a venture." "But my mother has some balls of pack thread with which she measured the height of the giant tree," interrupted Ernest, "and nothing would be more easy than to tie a stone to the end of one of them and throw it to the other side of the river. Then we could draw it to the very brink, and thus obtain the exact length that would be required for our timbers." "Your idea is excellent," cried I. "Run quickly and fetch the pack thread." He returned without loss of time. The stone was tied to its end and thrown across as we had planned. We drew it gently back to the river edge, marking the place where the bridge was to rest. We next measured the string and found that the distance from one side to the other was 18 feet. It appeared to me that to give a sufficient solidity to the timbers, I must allow 3 feet of extra length at each end for fixing them, making therefore in all 24, and I was fortunate enough to find that many of those we had brought did not fall short of this length. There now remained the difficulty of carrying one end across the stream, but we determined to discuss this part of the subject while we ate our dinner, which had been waiting for us more than an hour. We hurried through our meal, each being deeply interested in the work we were about to undertake, and thinking only of the part which might be assigned him toward the execution of the nonsuch. For this, for mutual encouragement, was the name we gave our bridge even before it was in existence. Having consulted as to the means of laying our timbers across the river, the first thing I did was to attach one of them to the trunk of the tree, of which I have already spoken, by a strong cord long enough to turn freely round the trunk. I then fastened a second cord to the other end of the timber, and tying a stone to its extremity, flung it to the opposite bank. I next passed the river as I had done before, furnished with a pulley, which I secured to a tree. I passed my second cord through the pulley, and recrossing the river with this cord in my hand, I contrived to harness the ass and cow to the end of the cord. I next drove the animals from the bank of the river. They resisted at first, but I made them go by force of drawing. I first fixed one end of the beam firmly to the trunk of the tree, and then they drew along the other end so as gradually to advance over the river. Presently, to my great joy, I saw it touch the other side, and at length become fixed and firm by its own weight. In a moment Fritz and Jack leaped upon the timber, and in spite of my paternal fears, crossed the stream with a joyful step upon this narrow but effective bridge. The first timber being thus laid, the difficulty was considerably diminished. A second and a third were fixed in succession, and with the greatest ease. Fritz and I, standing on opposite sides of the river, placed them at such distances from each other as was necessary to form a broad and handsome bridge. What now remained to be done was to lay some short planks across them quite close to each other, which we executed so expeditiously that our construction was completed in a much shorter time than I should have imagined possible. Our labor, however, had occasioned us so much fatigue that we found ourselves unable for that day to enter upon new exertions, and the evening beginning to set in, we returned to our home, where we partook heartily of an excellent supper and went to bed. Chapter 9. Change of Abode. As soon as we were up and had breakfasted the next morning, I assembled all the members of my family together to take with them a solemn farewell of this our first place of reception from the awful disaster of the shipwreck. I directed my sons to assemble our whole flock of animals and to leave the ass and the cow to me, that I might load them with the sacks which my wife had made. I had filled these and made a slit long ways in the middle of each, and to each side of the slits I tied several long pieces of cord, which, crossing each other and being again brought round and fastened, served to hold the sacks firmly on the back of the animal. We next began to put together all the things that we should stand most in need of for the 2 or 3 first days in our new abode: working implements, kitchen utensils, the captain's service of plate, and a small provision of butter, etc., etc. I put these articles into the 2 ends of each sack, taking care that the sides should be equally heavy, and then fastened them on. I afterwards added our hammocks to complete the load, and we were about to begin to march when my wife stopped me. "We must not," said she, "leave our fowls behind, for fear they should become the prey of the jackals. We must contrive a place for them among the luggage, and also one for our little Francis, who cannot walk so far, and would interrupt our speed. There is also my enchanted bag, which I recommend to your particular care," said she, smiling, "for who can tell what may yet pop out of it for your good pleasure?" I now placed the child on the ass's back, fixing the enchanted bag in such a way as to support him, and I tied them together with so many cords that the animal might even have galloped without danger of his falling off. We packed and placed in the tent everything we were to leave, and for greater security fastened down the ends of the sailcloth at the entrance by driving stakes through them into the ground. We ranged a number of vessels, both full and empty, round the tent to serve as a rampart, and thus we confided to the protection of heaven our remaining treasures. At length we set ourselves in motion. Each of us, great and small, carried a gun upon his shoulder and a game bag at his back. My wife led the way with her eldest son, the cow, and the ass immediately behind them. The goats, conducted by Jack, came next. The little monkey was seated on the back of his nurse and made 1,000 grimaces. After the goats came Ernest, conducting the sheep, while I, in my capacity of general superintendent, followed behind and brought up the rear. The dogs, for the most part, pranced backwards and forwards like adjutants to a troop of soldiers. Our march was slow, and there was something solemn and patriarchal in the spectacle we exhibited. I fancied we must resemble our forefathers journeying in the deserts, accompanied by their families and their possessions. On the other side of the river, we experienced an inconvenience wholly unexpected. The tempting aspect of the grass, which grew here in profusion, drew off our animals, who strayed from us to feed upon it, so that without the dogs we should not have been able to bring them back to the line of our procession. The active creatures were of great use to us on this occasion, and when everything was restored to proper order, we were able to continue our journey. For fear, however, of a similar occurrence, I directed our march to the left along the seaside, where the produce of the soil was not of a quality to attract them. But scarcely had we advanced a few steps on the sands when our 2 dogs, which had strayed behind among the grass, set up a sort of howl as if engaged in an encounter with some formidable animal. Fritz in an instant raised his gun to his cheek and was ready to fire. Ernest, always somewhat timid, drew back to his mother's side. Jack ran bravely after Fritz with his gun upon his shoulder, while I, fearing the dogs might be attacked by some dangerous wild beast, prepared myself to advance to their assistance. But youth is always full of ardor, and in spite of my exhortations to proceed with caution, the boys, eager for the event, made but 3 jumps to the place from which the noise proceeded. In an instant, Jack had turned to meet me, clapping his hands and calling out, "Come quickly, father, come quickly! Here is a monstrous porcupine!" I soon reached the spot and perceived that it was really, as he said, baiting a little exaggeration. The dogs were running to and fro with bleeding noses about the animal, and when they approached too near him, he made a frightful noise and pierced them with his quills so deeply and suddenly that the pain the wounds occasioned made them howl violently. While we were looking on, Jack determined on an attack, which succeeded well. He took one of the pistols which he carried in his belt and aimed it so exactly at the head of the porcupine that he fell dead the instant he fired and before he had a notion of what he was about. We now all got round the extraordinary animal, on whom nature had bestowed a strong defense by arming his body all over with long spears. The boys were at a loss what means to use for carrying away his carcass. They thought of dragging it along the ground, but as often as they attempted to take hold, there was nothing but squalling and running to show the marks made by his quills on their hands. "We must leave him behind," said they, "but it is a great pity." While the boys were talking, my wife and I had hastened to relieve the dogs by examining the wounds which had been inflicted by the quills. Fritz had run on before with his gun, hoping he should meet with some animal of prey. We followed him at our leisure, taking care not to expose our health by unnecessary fatigue, till at last, without further accident or adventure, we arrived at the place of the giant trees. Such indeed we found them, and our astonishment exceeded all description. Good heavens, what trees, what a height, what trunks! I never heard of any so prodigious, exclaimed one and all. Nothing can be more rational than your admiration, answered I, measuring them with my eyes as I spoke. I must confess I had not myself formed an idea of the reality. To you be all the honor, my dear wife, of the discovery of this agreeable abode in which we shall enjoy so many comforts and advantages. The great point we have to gain is the fixing a tent large enough to receive us all in one of these trees, by which means we shall be perfectly secure from the invasion of wild beasts. I defy even one of the bears, who are so famous for mounting trees, to climb up by a trunk so immense and so destitute of branches. We now began to release our animals from their burdens, having first thrown our own on the grass. We next used the precaution of tying their 2 forelegs together with a cord, that they might not go far away or lose themselves. We restored the fowls to liberty, and then seating ourselves upon the grass, we held a family council on the subject of our future establishment. I was myself somewhat uneasy on the question of our safety during the ensuing night, for I was ignorant of the nature of the extensive country I beheld around me, and what chance there might be of our being attacked by different kinds of wild beasts. I accordingly observed to my wife that I would make an endeavor for us all to sleep in the tree that very night. While I was deliberating with her on the subject, Fritz had stolen away to a short distance, and we heard the report of a gun. This would have alarmed me if at the same moment we had not recognized Fritz's voice crying out, "I touched him! I touched him!" And in a moment we saw him running toward us, holding a dead animal of uncommon beauty by the paws. Father, look, here is a superb tiger cat," said he, proudly raising it in the air to show it to the best advantage. "Bravo, bravo," cried I. "Bravo, Nimrod the Undaunted. Your exploit will call forth the gratitude of our cocks, hens, and pigeons, for you have rendered them what they cannot fail to think an important service. If you had not killed this animal, he would no doubt have demolished in one night our whole stock of poultry. One idea occurs to me. Skin the animal carefully so as not to injure it, particularly the parts which cover the forelegs and the tail. You may then make yourself a belt with it like your brother Jack's. The odd pieces will serve to make some cases to contain our utensils for the table, such as knives, forks, and spoons. Go then, boy, and put away its head, and we will see how to set about preparing the skin." The boys left me no moment of repose till I had shown them how to take off the skins of the animals without tearing them. In the meanwhile, Ernest looked about for a flat stone as a sort of foundation for a fireplace, and little Francis collected some pieces of dry wood for his mother to light a fire. Ernest was not long in finding what he wanted, and then he ran to join us and give us his assistance, or rather to reason, right or wrong, on the subject of skinning animals, and then on that of trees, making various comments and inquiries respecting the real name of those we intended to inhabit. "It is my opinion," said he, "that they are really and simply enormously large hazel trees. See if the leaf is not of exactly the same form." "But that is no proof," interrupted I, "for many trees bear leaves of the same shape, but nevertheless are of different kinds." Presently, little Francis came running with his mouth crammed full of something and calling out, "Mamma, Mamma, I have found a nice fruit to eat, and I have brought you home some of it." "Little glutton," replied his mother, quite alarmed, "what have you got there? For heaven's sake, do not swallow in this imprudent manner the first thing that falls in your way, for by this means you may be poisoned, and then you would die." She made him open his mouth and took out with her finger what he was eating with so keen a relish. With some difficulty, she drew out the remains of a fig. "A fig!" exclaimed I. "Where did you get this fig?" "Francis, I got it among the grass, Papa, and there are a great many more. I thought it must be good to eat, for the fowls and the pigeons and even the pig came to the place and ate them in large quantities." "Father, you see then, my dear," said I to my wife, "that our beautiful fig trees are fig trees, at least the kind which are thus named in the Antilles. I took this occasion to give the boys another lesson on the necessity of being cautious, and never to venture on tasting anything they met with till they had seen it eaten by birds and monkeys." At the word monkeys, they all ran to visit the little orphan, whom they found seated on the root of a tree, and examining with the oddest grimaces the half-skinned tiger cat which lay near him. Francis offered him a fig, which he first turned round and round, and smelled at it, and concluded by eating it voraciously. "Bravo, bravo, Mr. Monkey!" exclaimed the boys, clapping their hands. "So then these figs are good to eat." In the meanwhile, my wife had been busy in making a fire, putting on the pot, and preparing for our dinner. The tiger cat was bestowed upon the dogs, who waited impatiently to receive it. While our dinner was dressing, I employed my time in making some packing needles with some of the quills of the porcupine, which the boys had contrived to draw from his skin and bring home. I put the point of a large nail into the fire till it was red hot. Then, taking hold of it with some wet linen in my hand, by way of guard, I with great ease perforated the thick end of the quills with it. I had soon the pleasure of presenting my wife with a large packet of long, stout needles, which were the more valuable in her estimation, as she had formed the intention of contriving some better harness for our animals, and had been perplexed how to set about it without some larger needles. I had singled out the highest fig tree, and while we were waiting for dinner, I made the boys try how high they could throw a stick or stone into it. I also tried myself, but the lowest branches were so far from the ground that none of us could touch them. I perceived, therefore, that we should want some new inventions for fastening the ends of my ladder to them. I allowed a short pause to my imagination, during which I assisted Jack and Fritz in carrying the skin of the tiger cat to a near rivulet, where we confined it under water with some large stones. After this, we returned and dined heartily on some slices of ham and bread and cheese under the shade of our favorite trees. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 10. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.